Good evening. Welcome to PONTE. This program is part of El Museo de Tu Casa, which is part of our new online bilingual initiative, encouraging visitors to explore and learn more about Latino art and culture. Tonight, we have a very special PONTE with our good friend, Veronica Agard. A little bit about Veronica before we get started. Veronica was born and raised on unceded Lenape land. She's a Brooklyn-based writer and educator whose identity is inseparable from her work as someone of Afro-Caribbean, African-American, and Indigenous descent. Through her writing and organizing, she proudly defines herself as a connector at the intersection of Black identity, creative wellness, representation, and culture, while she experiments with forms of healing. As an alumni of CUNY City College of New York and as a future social worker from Fordham University, she sincerely believes in putting theory into practice, with recent bylines at the redefining of womanhood, Black girl magic, life as ceremony, and Black and well. Veronica is the creator behind the Who Heals the Healer experience and is an associate producer with Your Magic and facilitates the Ancestors in Training Education Project. That is a lot. How are you, Veronica?
I'm well. I'm cackling, and that's the short bio. At times when I wonder if I'm doing enough, like that, I'm like, yeah, I'm doing enough.
You're doing the work, which is good. It's funny because I was going to ask you. I had two different files of you, and I wanted to make sure this is the correct one. But I'm glad we went with this one here.
That's the shorter, like people can find
the digestible
links and all the things if they want to know more. But yeah, I'm doing well. It was pretty windy today, apparently in New York, enough for Citizen to say that there's a bunch of trees that fell. So I hope everybody is safe wherever they are. If they're on the East Coast, especially if they're calling in from the New York City area. I am well. I'm in good health. My family is in good health. Yeah,
I think that's all we can ask for, right?
That's all that I can really ask for at this time.
It's truly a blessing this time, right?
Yes.
Brian, let's talk.
Yes.
I'm curious to know. I mean, we know each other a little bit, right? And you know, I'm obviously a fan of what you do. I wanted to know a little bit more about the backstory, right? So, how did you get started with this?
Yeah, sure. And my mom and my grandmother are on here somewhere, hiding behind a screen, and my dad should be here soon. But also, family friends are on here as well. So it's really nice to be able to share this in a way where it's palatable for everyone, right? Because one of the things that's important to me is to make sure that no matter what it is that I'm presenting, it has to be able to be shared in a way where it's accessible. Like, so you take away all the degrees that somebody has, all the experiences that somebody has, and the story should be able to translate. So in terms of my own story, like the bio said, the shorter version is my parents met at college in the 80s. My mom's family is from Alabama. My father is from Guyana, St. Kitts, and Barbados. The Barbados part was funny in terms of how we found that out. That's a story for another time. But I got started with that because, and I'm saying this jokingly, like I believe that I was a why kid. I questioned a lot of things. I wanted to know more about like where we came from, and like not just like, oh, so-and-so was born here, but like, okay, but why, especially in terms of as I got older, understanding the Great Migration and what the circumstances were for my grandmother to come up here in the 60s in the first place. Like as soon as I started getting old enough to ask those kind of questions, it actually became a process of healing for me around the time when my late uncle and my late grandmother on my paternal side passed away back to back. That's almost 10 years now. And a lot of the questions that we explore together in the process of like this whole project of Ancestors in Training came about because some of these questions are questions I wished I could have asked people while they were still living. So I always implore people to take the questions with them afterwards and ask their elders as well, as also just as a way of remembrance in general. And it's also just interesting in doing this work to try and figure out like, well, how come I'm into certain kind of spiritualities and, you know, quote unquote, feeling like I'm the only one, when in actuality, asking certain questions, you realize that you're not really alone. So I've been doing Ancestors in Training as a project for 3 years now. Yeah, 3 years now. 4 cycles technically, but 3 years calendar wise. And it's been really interesting to see how it resonates with people, how it takes shape. And I think, especially for me, given these times, I think it's really important to start having these kind of conversations and thinking through what our legacies are going to be, and also figuring out how to have a practice, whether that's a healing practice or an oral history project, whatever it is, like whatever our practice is during these times, all of those different types of medicines are valid and all of them are needed right now because of everything that's happening. So that's a little bit more about how I got started in terms of this process, because anything that I share publicly, especially in terms of my projects, are questions that I ask myself. So please, when the questions come later, the prompts, and usually people are like, wow, that's really deep. It's really profound. I'm like, these are questions I've asked myself as a means to figure out how to move forward. So that way, when hypothetical children of mine call on me for advice, or like grandchildren, like I want to practice what kind of ancestor they will call on now while I'm here to actually affect that kind of change. I hope that answered that question.
Definitely, no, I appreciate it. I don't want to waste too much time asking many questions. I know you have a whole presentation.
Okay.
I think you were not here to hear me talk. So I'm gonna let you get started. I just want to encourage people, if they have questions, to go ahead and share that in the chat. We'll be monitoring that.
Yes, please.
And Veronica as well will be looking at it. So by all means, if you have any questions throughout, feel free to chat, and then we'll get to those questions. All right?
Yes. Okay. So everything that I'm about to share, whether it's a slide, a video, or anything like that, everyone will receive through the email that they use to sign up for this. Okay, so if you didn't sign up for whatever reason, or you're not sure, please make sure that either myself or the Museo team has your email, so that way you can receive everything that you're about to see. So here we go. Share that screen, share. Okay, so I can't see everybody. Obviously, this is the one thing about Zoom. I love it, but I can't read the room literally when we do these kind of presentations. So I implore folks to use the chat. That'll be the easiest way for me to see something real time. Things that people can share in the chat or ask also is, if you see something and you're like, huh, like I don't get it, what does that mean? Please ask me to clarify, so that way I make sure that it's accessible to everybody, okay? So in case you stumbled upon this by accident, this is Ancestors in Training Sustainable Legacies with Ponte Ready, sponsored by Museo del Barrio. Again, thank you to Christian and everyone for making me feel very like held, and also it's like almost like a little birthday present to me because I turned 30 on the 21st. So I'm really excited to be able to share this information with everyone. So yeah. And again, my name is Veronica Agard. I use she, her pronouns. And those are my Instagram handles. And this is the day. It's also a full moon today, in case anybody missed it, or if anybody else was like up at like 2:30 and couldn't go back to sleep. That's what that was. So here goes. I like making sure that all of my slides, share where we hope to go throughout this process. It also helps me as a facilitator, because the time is fleeting always with these conversations. We can talk about ancestors and spirituality and the world hours, right? Good. But we only have about 45 minutes, and by 45, I really mean 30, because I don't want to talk at a screen. I really want to be in conversation with folks, and I really hope to hear what brought y'all here at some point in the conversation. So with that all being said, I'm going to continue to introduce this concept with some background information and some videos. I'm going to share the intentions that were shared not only in the event description, but have been shared on social media recently. Then we're going to go into the application or the exploration of some of the themes within this project. And one of those themes is primarily something called healing justice. Then we're going to go into what I call a healing practice, which is actually the writing portion, if you will. With that also being said, if you don't have somewhere to capture this information, whether you want to use your phone or you want to use a notebook, if you're old school like that, please go grab that within the next few moments, because you will need it in about 20 minutes plus or minus. And then at the end, you'll see all of the resources and links that you will receive in the near future. And then we can open it up for questions, comments, or anything like that. So here we go. This is from 2018. When the privilege to do this series and exploration of a project with the Caribbean culture in Harlem, not too far from El Museo. And we did 3 events. Here is of me explaining the concept. In the 2 this has been made, I found a way to explain it. So we're gonna play it now.
Even with this term or phrase, ancestors in training, it comes from the book by Yeye Luisha Test, who wrote Jambalaya. She has a quote, not from that book, but she has a quote that says, "We are the ancestors of the future, and what we do now will have an impact." And when I read that, I was like, oh, like that's a workshop in and of itself. That is a thing. When I say ancestors in training, that also includes the indigenous teachings of doing work for the next 7 generations. So the next 7 generation medicine is to walk and do this work for that 7th generation in your lineage that you know you will not see, and to do the work to walk a particular way and to talk a particular way, or to set things in motion so that way that descendant won't have to potentially struggle as much. So it's very much rooted in conjure work that is being named in Jambalaya, the book, and also from the Ifa and Yoruba traditions, but then also from the indigenous teachings, because as someone who's part indigenous, but also just understanding that we are on Lenape land, like that has to be an active part of this work that we do around ancestors, because we walk on land that was taken away. So all of that swirled around to get to this point of how do we lean into the fact that we won't be here forever, that our time here is finite. And if we understand that our time here is finite from a place that isn't rooted in fear, or isn't this kind of bodily reaction, but actually more open, as opposed to a closed fist that says, I have to grab all of these things and I have to grab up all these resources and I have to be the one to have it, to have more of an open palm and say, okay, here it is. Here's what I have to give. Here's what I have to offer. So this workshop series is me saying, here's what it is for me right now. This is what I have to offer. And if I'm not the one sharing knowledge, here are all the other people that I've learned in community with, or I am able to build with around this theme.
Yeah, so 2018 me was pretty smart. I would like to think I'm smarter still. I'm still learning, still growing, but that is the best minute and 30-second explanation of ancestors in training as a concept. The only thing I would add to that now is that it's a concept, it's a frame of mind, it's a way of being, it's whatever it is that it needs to be for the people who are trying to apply it. So for me, I think about it as a mindset or a mentality of how I want to move through the world. So these are the intentions that were shared publicly. These have changed in about 1.5 years, because actually sustainable legacies is a subtopic within Ancestors in Training, came about 2 years ago when I first taught this as a class to youth in the Sadie Nash Leadership Project Summer Institute. I taught this to a group of 15 juniors and seniors in high school. And one of the things that we were talking about is at the heart of this as well, but also questions came about that said, well, what happens if people don't have a good relationship with their ancestors anyway? Or like, what if our cultures don't have good relationships with the dead anyhow? So that ended up being a conversation that we directly had in the class. So part of what you're experiencing is the lessons and the conversations that we had with youth. And by with, I mean, it was a circle conversation. I threw up some questions. They gave me some questions back. I sat and I listened. And I want to name that as well, that this work and concept of ancestor and training is intergenerational. It has to be by design. These are conversations that have to happen with the youth in our life, all through to the elders in our life. So questions that came about back then were, what does it mean to be an ancestor in training in the face of climate grief, consumption in an uncertain future? That question in particular is more relevant than ever in the pandemic that we are in. Can you be somebody's ancestor without having direct descendants? Questions of chosen family and chosen children as opposed to blood children or blood ties. How can we live lives that our descendants in the next 7 generations can be proud of? And given the state of the world, what environment will the next 3 generations inherit? So not just greats, but what will our great-great-grandchildren inherit? What world will that be, right? Will we be here? Will we won't? Will we have colonized the moon for no apparent reason? We don't know, but it's important to have a conversation now while we're still here. So like I mentioned in the video from Connie, there is a book by this wonderful human being, Yeye Luisha Tish. She is a long-time initiated priestess of Oshun. She wrote a book called Jambalaya that I found 3 summers ago when I was trying to start to deepen my own practice of wellness and healing. And this is a clip from a longer movie, but I wanted to play this in terms of understanding some of the spirituality and the technologies that are at the heart of this project, especially because her words inspired this project. So I want to make sure that I give all praise and props to her, especially while she is still here to receive that affirmation. So here you go.
Eshuo elegbadae, Eshuo elegbadae, elegbada mofori bale elegbago. I just sang to open this session, asking that Elegba, who is the trickster of the Yoruba pantheon and the linguist and the magician, I'm saying to him, Elegba, you know, you are king. I bend my knees in honor to you. Elegba, be cool. 40 years ago, the only thing you would have been able to find on Yoruba tradition would have been written by some British anthropologist who had already decided that we were a bunch of savages who didn't know what we were doing and didn't have a language and all of that. And so all of that got interpreted through his lens, okay? We went through a period where people who were educated were told to stay away because this would primitivize them, okay? And then my generation and a few before me said, well, you've educated me, I have a bright intelligence, but I want to look at my own stuff. You know, I can say to you that the Orishas are, number one, the forces of nature personified. We personify them. The ocean is so vast that the only way me as the human can comprehend that vastness is to say, Olokun is the bottom of the ocean, Konla is the white foam on the ocean, Ogunti is a wave hitting the sea, Achaba is an anchor in the ocean. I break it up into parts that are digestible for me, but I don't fool myself. The ocean came before me. Okay, and for millennia we looked at the ocean, we noticed its behavior, we noticed that certain ones of us behave just like it. Okay, and we call that person a child of that natural force. Okay, knowing that you are a child of that natural force, that is your place in the universe, that is part of your contract with creation, allows you to shamelessly be yourself. Okay? And in shamelessly being yourself, you are merged with all of nature. Okay? Now, one of the problems that people have in understanding this is that Western investigators did the anthropomorphic thing that separated us from nature. So people will say, well, you know, when you're talking about Shango, you're talking about the fourth Alafin of Oyo, a man who was a king in Nigeria. Yes, that's true, but that man was named after the deity. And that man becomes part of the folklore of the mythology of the deity. He was a child of the thunder. He had a thundering voice. He ruled. He had issues of justice. And when he died, and this is where Christians get upset with me, there is no difference between me saying Obako So that the man Shango, who was the son of thunder, ascended. That's the JC story all over again. Okay, a man who was the son of God went through some stuff, you know, ended up being hung next to two thieves, proved himself to be above that, and they say he ascended. We are all going to ascend if we fulfill our contract with creation.
I gotta pause it there and invite everybody to watch the rest of it because we don't have a whole lot of time. But if I may surmise the rest of it without spoiling it, she continues to go on and share more information around shared cosmologies, right? And I wanted to make sure that I put this in here because when we talk about different spiritualities and we talk about different faith systems that are coming up right now, and especially right now in this moment of mass grief, where I don't know if everybody else had this kind of experience in the beginning of quarantine, but at the beginning of quarantine, it felt like everyone was saying, oh, I'm just gonna, this means if I don't have to go to work, then this means I have all this time for myself. I'll be able to do my spiritual path. I'll be able to set up my altar better. I'll be able to insert something here, right? Or, okay, maybe I'll finally be able to do these kind of things. And the question then becomes, how can we do this work? How can we make this an extended, deliberate practice? Thanks, Mom. How can we ensure that we're really making a ritual, whatever it is that we need to embody in these times, right? And in the rest of that video, she explores more about it. She explores more about how we are all experiencing these kind of things, and especially indigenous traditions, whether they are indigenous to the continent of Africa or they are indigenous to the so-called America. Every culture has a different practice. Every culture has a medicine that is needed at this time. But it also, there's a tension right now and a conversation around who has access to the technologies and who doesn't. Like, should everybody be initiated into an Ifa Yoruba tradition, or do we need to keep some things off of the internet, right? Do we need to buy and stockpile all this sage and not understand that indigenous folks to the Americas could not burn sage and incense in ceremony up until 1978. Some of us, including myself, were not even alive, right? So some of these laws and these things that impacted our recent ancestors not that long ago are still being unearthed, for lack of a better term. So I believe in the phrase, once you know. So once we know all these kinds and we listen to elders, we listen to the youth, and we have conversations like these, the question is, how can we use this as a lens to move forward? And actually, somewhere on Twitter recently, speaking of Nigeria, the artist Jidena, he actually said this in relation to something else. He said, many African traditional religions encourage the balancing of what Taoism calls yin and yang. The aim was not to purge the lower self and become your higher. It was to merge the two and become whole. So I take issue when self-help gurus don't focus on shadow work as well, right? So shadow is another one of those words that comes up all the time now. And you should be doing this, or you should be doing this, or if you don't do this, then you don't have all of your, spiritual woke points, for lack of a better phrase. But it's actually detrimental to each other. We should be more conversations of, okay, what do I need to learn still? What can I learn from someone else? What books do I need to read? Which, by the way, everyone needs access to the syllabus that is the same as this whole project, because 3 years ago, I realized that a lot of folks asked me what I read and what I did or what I learned from to have this mind. So I made a document. So you'll see that later on. But the exploration of these kind of things, especially in terms of understanding that old technology is really not that far removed, or things that are called new age are really things that have been around for a long time. I view healing justice within that same spectrum, because healing justice as a phrase, as you see here on this slide, was not really popularized as a term until 2007, when Black and Brown folks were mobilizing in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, because the government was not providing for their people. You can see that now with the community fridges that are across the country and probably across the world, trying to close the gap of being hungry and making sure that everybody has something to eat. So one of the things that you can use in terms of a framework is healing justice, but also just breaking it apart, so that way it's not just okay, healing justice goes over here with social justice, which goes over here with insert some other term here. Because if we don't understand the implications for it in our real lives, then it's nice, but what's the point? Normally I would read this, but because we are short on time and I actually want to make sure that this conversation is more interactive, I'm going to skip this. However, I really encourage folks to look at this later when you receive the slides, to understand what some of Kindred's roots were and thought processes were when they decided to close the gap and provide all different types of healing services to people in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, because they realized it wasn't going to happen otherwise. Another way that we can actually frame that is something called mutual aid, right? Like the practice of being able to exchange services or support for each other in times, not in times of crises, but also how can we move away from it being just in a moment of crisis. So I will read this part, and I gotta slide y'all over a little bit or minimize everybody, but the phrase healing justice actually can be broken down like this. It's nothing new to invite people into your home, give them some tea, listen to their grief, hold space for their pain, lay them down on cushions on the floor and pray them, or touch them or move energy, and offer them some remedies made from plants and stones. Our healing traditions are so massively co-opted, then mangled in the law of capitalism. People need self-determined, bone-deep, individual care and in a community healing framework, because we are all still healing from isolation from each other. We are still healing from racism and poverty and oppression and trauma. And we need healers who get that, to offer us their time, skills, time and skills to help us heal on an individual and collective level. And that's from an article called More Healing, More of the Time, and not personal history of the justice movement. So given that all of these things in terms of the flashpoints that I referenced, right? If we're using Hurricane Katrina as a flashpoint, this current pandemic is going to be another flashpoint in terms of healing and how we took care of each other, right? So if the lesson bears repeating as needed, the question becomes now what? And if we know these kind of things and we know these lineages of healing and wellness that we come from, how can we make sure that we continue these conversations and also document them, right? I mentioned at the beginning that some of the questions that we're going to explore and write about together are questions that I wish that I asked some of my elders before they passed, right? What happens when we become our own archive? What happens when we become the family archivist, right? My family can attest to that. I'm usually the one that will say, like, well, what, so-and-so, or like, were they really from here? Or like, are we, so what happened to them? Like, I started to ask that, unfortunately, after people passed away. So my advice, again, is to ask questions while people are still here. And also to have conversations, as scary as this may be, in terms of when our time comes, how do we want to be celebrated? How do we want to be mourned, right? Like, what will that look like? And to have that conversation with the people immediately in our lives, again, while they are well, so that way when things go the way that they need to go, it's one less thing to think about. And again, that's scary. My mother and I have talked about this, and at first I was really sad, but I realized that it was better for us to have that conversation now than to, you know, God forbid something go wrong. And this point right here around the United States and capitalism is decaying. This is another point that we're living in, right? Like, we're living in a time where so the divides amongst class are getting much and much more evident. If we're actually going to move forward, we have to be able to have conversations around how healing, justice, and wellness, and who has access to care, right? Like, access to healthcare. Like, why isn't healthcare universal right now? Why are people dying that should not have to die? Right? Like, these are conversations that we can start to have now as an ancestor in training. So that way, when our descendants come, and if they call on us, right, whatever that looks like, they can say, okay, my ancestor Veronica was the type to ask questions. She was a Sagittarius. She was to the point, said, hey, I have a question, right? And hopefully that will inspire some bravery for those who come after me. So another question that comes up a lot is, well, what happens if my ancestors caused harm in their lifetime, right? And for those of us who are descended from enslaved Africans, this comes up in the form of, well, my DNA that I was 15% white, like, how did that get there? And if we understand the historical implications of that, we have to do some really tough investigating to be like, okay, do I really want to call, when I call on my ancestors, do I want to call on the folks that enslaved some of my ancestors? Like, should I do that? The answer is probably not. The invitation is to be more compassionate when you're exploring that within your family. And when you're doing the family tree work, and you can only go back to, like, if you're descended from slavery in the United States, you can only go back to like 1860 something in most cases. And after that, the closest way that you can figure out where your ancestors were, who they might have been, is if you're lucky, you'll find out what plantation they were on, and you'll be able to find another ancestral home that way. And I actually did that for my maternal line, actually, and found out that that plantation still stands in Alabama. And I was like, oh, why didn't I think of this before? And it actually is, I'm sharing that as an example to share that these are things that are happening in real time. And I'm not here to be like, I figured out how to be an ancestor in training. Here's this formula. Apply this all over your life. No, this is in practice. This is in conversation. It's responsive to the times. So with that all being said, my suggestion to fellow folks who have ancestors who might not be there, be in the DNA, consensual, lack of a better term, is to extend compassion to the ancestors that you know or suspect did not live peaceful lives, acknowledge forward. But at the same time, cultivate a relationship with your honorable ancestors, known and unknown, at your sacred space. And the known and unknown part is really important too, because like I said about the history books only going but so far, oral history and oral traditions often capture that gap, right? So that's also why writing is a tool for me in general, so that we can capture our own stories and tell them in our own voice and our own lens. That way it's not somebody outside of our culture or outside of our family telling a story. And then also speak to your future descendants about the power that they come from, right? So just now I was talking about how, like, I hope my future descendants call on me if they need to be brave, or if they need to speak up, or they need to speak their mind, because I'm not afraid to speak my mind, right? I'm comfortable talking, right? So yeah. And also, like, future descendants, meaning if you are not fortunate or you choose not to have children for whatever valid reason, I also believe that you can have chosen descendants. Again, like, I have a crew of chosen children from my college advising work that I've full on adopted, and they're like 19, 20, 21. But I pray for them like I pray for hypothetical children of mine that are coming. I hope that makes sense, because I can't see the chat. So I actually did good on time. Okay, sorry, I talk a lot, in case you haven't caught that yet. So I was very much concerned that we weren't gonna get to this part. Like I keep alluding to, one of the frames within a frame of ancestors in training, or a tool that is particularly helpful, because again, for those of us who come from enslaved peoples, or even folks who did not have the privilege to be educated, we who can write, in whatever language we can, whatever we feel comfortable to fully express ourselves, I think it's a part of our duty to write. So this is the part where you're going to need a notebook, or you're going to need somewhere to capture the answers to the questions that I'm going to ask. Now, the idea is, and I throw my hands up like this to be like, please don't come for me later and say, oh, there wasn't enough time to answer the question. No, the idea is that you start these questions, or you start to ask these questions that are coming up. So that way it can be a part of a journaling practice. If you want to make it a part of your full moon ritual, if you haven't done something for today yet, go ahead. But the prompts are just that, they're prompts. They're invitations to explore. You can also ask your elders or your family the same questions. So here we go. So the invitation is, I'm sorry for the glare. to tap into your imagination and your inner knowing to explore the following questions. So you can pick just one, or if you are quick within 5 minutes and all, want to start to answer all three. Again, understand that you're going to get all of the things going through right now on this week, if not sooner. So you can go at your own pace when you receive the information. But the questions are, what current actions can you take in support of your descendants? When your future descendants pray to you, what do you want them to call on you for? Right? For those of you that saw the little Instagram slide, the rest of that should have said, embody that now, right? So if that's the question, what can you embody right now? So that way when your descendants call on you, you have practiced it, you made it a ritual, that's a memory. And then last, but certainly not least, what does an ancestor in training mean to you? The credit, if you will, is to, like I just said, ask these exact questions of your elders. Another bonus, and I'm not sure if my dad is here for this part, to ask your family where they were in 1968 when Martin Luther King had died and the riots were happening here in the United States. And I'm speaking to the United States context. If there is a similar flashpoint in history for you, wherever you are, you can change the year to a similar flashpoint. And I mentioned my dad because when I asked him this once during quarantine, he talked about being in the islands, I believe in St. Thomas. We're from St. Kitts, Guyana, Barbados. My paternal grandmother was from St. Kitts. So along the way home, they were watching the riots happening here. And he particularly remembered being 8 or 9 years old, watching what was happening here and asking my grandmother why they had to go here. It's like, why do we have to go? Like, it's nice here, like the water's right there, like, why do we have to leave? And my late grandmother said something to the effect of, because it'll be better for us there in spite of this. And she was right. Didn't mean that it was easy, but the fact that my dad remembers like down to like what the TV looked like. Sometimes with oral history and these kind of questions, you never know what people are really going to remember until you ask the question. So I am going to try and whoa, y'all were saying a lot of things in the chat. Oh, sorry. I'm gonna make this small if I can. Whoop. All right, I'm gonna temporarily stop the share so I can get it together. Actually, yes, this is actually a good moment. Hold on. One moment, please. X that out. So I'm gonna put on some music and y'all can answer the questions on the slides. I'm gonna multitask in the back. I'm gonna put on some music and I'll put the slide with the questions on it. Start marinating, thinking about what question you want to answer. I'm also going to put the questions in the chat since folks are using the chat. But yeah, for folks that are on Facebook, again, maybe somehow, some way we'll be able to put it over there. But yeah, one moment. I'm going to copy and paste it in the chat first. Again, I could talk about this for hours. We probably should talk about this for hours, but we only have so much time. So those are the questions in the chat, and I'm going to go back to my other screen. Share the screen. Here we go. All right, and we're back. So I'm going to play a song. Questions are in the chat. When we come back, I want to hear from y'all, and I may start with the questions that were asked in the chat while I was presenting. So actually, yeah, edit. I'm going to start with the questions that were asked in the chat while I was presenting. And then if anybody else has questions, please feel free to continue the discussion in the chat. Make this bigger. Whoops, that did not do it. Skip. The song is about 3 minutes, right?
Purchase your tracks today. Purchase your tracks today.
We're about halfway through the song. I'm actually going to keep continuing here. That way, as soon as it's done, we can jump back in. After this, I'm going to stop tracks.
Purchase your tracks today.
I'm actually going to stop it for a second. Hold on. So I want to make sure that I say this because I realized I didn't say this when we were talking earlier. So hold on one second. A part of what's really special about being able to share this work in general, but also the fact that it keeps resonating with people. It's not lost on me that y'all could have been anywhere in the world, literally, but you chose to be here. I also want to name that there needs to be more conversations that happen like these amongst different diasporas, right? El Museo del Barrio is primarily an institution that serves Spanish-speaking descended folks, right? But here I am, an English descended speaking person, right? As many of my Puerto Rican friends say, like a vecino from St. Kitts, right? Like we share a lot of similar experiences, but also our experiences are unique, and that it's okay to have more collaboration. It's okay to have more conversations, especially across traditions, especially across faiths and spiritualities. I think that that is the embodiment of the phrase, if you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room. Yes, there are certain knowledges and certain things that need to be kept in certain rooms and not cross-pollinate. But one of the things I think that is a danger is that sometimes we stay within our particular ethnic enclaves and we don't collaborate. So I wanted to make sure that I said that literally on the record because that is important. So I'm gonna get out of here. And somebody said something in the chat, so I'm gonna go over there. So a Puerto Rican watching in Australia. Like, is there, hold on. Where's the confetti? There we go. I don't even know what time it is over there. And there's folks in what is now called Vancouver. I actually had the privilege to be over there a couple of years ago to present some of my work. So that land is supercharged. I'm gonna scroll up a bit. If you ask me this privately, I'm not gonna say your name. Hold on. And Museo said, what if the elders in our family aren't very open to these conversations because of internalized racism? Yes, right? Especially if we're talking about indigenous traditions, right? A part of, and this happened to everybody, by the way. This is not a Black, white, Latinx thing. Everybody underneath capitalism and racism and all the isms had their indigenous cultures taken away from them. It happened to everybody. Otherwise, capitalism wouldn't have worked, right? The way that they had the commons and all this other, that's a workshop for another time. But understand that everybody has an indigenous culture. It's just that some cultures had it removed from them earlier. So then by the time the mass slave trade happened, these kind of mechanisms were unfortunately a well-oiled machine. And one of the ways in which that shows up is internalized racism around practices. So that can look like, and I don't want to speak to anybody else's experiences because I can't pretend to be anything other than Black. So I don't pretend to know this, but I can hear that come up when folks who are the Spanish-speaking diaspora want to be a part of African traditional religions, and all of the traditional religions get lumped into voodoo as a slur, as a form of anti-Blackness against Haiti, which, by the way, in case anybody didn't know, Haiti was the first country on this side of the world to liberate itself. So why would you not want to be associated with Haiti is my question. But the internalized racism can show up even in when we do or don't share, like, oh, I want to make an altar, or I want to do this. And actually, one of the books that can answer that question, speaking of Kadi, is a book called The Altar of My Soul by Dr. Marta Morena Vega. That is on the syllabus. That book is really good in terms of exploring that from an Afro-Puerto Rican identity. So if anybody has a similar background, I suggest they read that book. That book is in the syllabus. Hold on. I'm gonna have to be brief with these questions, these answers, my bad. How can conversations with family members about family history been complicated by tenuous relationships and pain that doesn't want to be spoken? That's nothing but a word. And I say that to say that sometimes when you ask these kind of questions, or you ask, well, how come we don't talk to so-and-so, or how come we moved from here to here, right? Within my own personal history, without getting into it, there is a story that happened between my grandfather and my late grandmother. I don't know what happened. I just know that it was traumatic enough for us to not know where he is, if he's still alive to this day. And a part of that conversation with my dad had to be more so, okay, like, how can we make sure that we know as much about our family and as much about our history, and make sure that we are in right relation with all our relations that we know of, as opposed to solely trying to dig up those kind of things, because it's very tricky. Because after a certain point, you may hit a roadblock, and then the question becomes, do you keep knocking? Do you try and keep hitting it? Or do you find a way to move around and say, okay, if I don't know, again, if I don't know enough about ABC ancestors, maybe I'll find out more about D, E, and F, right? And that's happened to me. That's what I meant about the the part about me finding out that I'm from Barbados. Like my paternal great-grandmother actually was born in Barbados. I thought she was Guyanese. That was a whole plot twist and a half in terms of me doing my research. And it came about because I was able to navigate those kind of tensions in terms of questions that brought up trauma, again, to the forefront, right? Because this is not a plug. I brought this out because this book is really important. The body keeps the score. It's on the syllabus. It is a really important book to address that question. What else? Instead, what role do you think younger generations have in elders with issues they are navigating, such as substance abuse? Do you think younger generations should use our energy to nurture elders who were unable to receive a wholesome upbringing? Speaking of the body keeps the score, there's such a thing as vicarious trauma, where like in asking those kind of difficult questions or holding space for someone's trauma, grief, pain, their story, when you open that up, you're also opening yourself up at the same time. And somebody said this to me as well, in general, when I do this work, that even I, as like facilitating ancestors and training as a concept, have to be careful because I don't want to reopen some of my trauma, my parents' trauma, some other ancestral stuff. I'm like, I don't want to do that, right? And it doesn't mean that I don't have those kind of conversations with them off stage. It just means I have to be very careful that something that happened to them or happened to an ancestor doesn't become my story, because I really do believe in this tension of, if you understand some of the things that your ancestors went through in their lifetime, you can understand how that shaped the people that then in turn shaped you. But also I don't think it's our responsibility to quote, fix or save, whatever turn of phrase you want to use, anyone when they're navigating those kind of things. I really believe in highlighting and inviting opportunities for people to do that work themselves. Like this whole presentation is an invitation, right? Y'all could turn this down after all of this, right? It's an invitation to do the work, right? So I think compassion is really big for me when navigating that. The question was somebody in the chat. Oh, oops. Okay, cool. As someone who is white presenting Puerto Rican, who has mixed ancestry, European colonizers, indigenous, Taino, and enslaved Africans, how do we cultivate a relationship and honor the ancestors who experienced trauma while refraining from co-opting the marginalized experience in the present day? High five, that's a great question. I see this happen on Twitter all the time. Twitter has a whole bunch of questions around this. Like there's spirituality Twitter and like lots of conversations happening on Twitter. But again, I really think that first of all, thank you to everybody who's asking really profound questions publicly in the chat. It's not lost on me, especially because some of these are really personal. It's like what I said before around having compassion for those ancestors, and especially that constellation of ancestors, because there was a lot of trauma that happened. I also think in general, my answer to how do we cultivate a relationship and honor the ancestors within that space is that we experience life in the ways that they couldn't. So for example, as someone who is descended from slavery, I rest a lot now. I'm not working. I take naps all the time. I believe in the work of the NAP ministry and QTPOC mental health initiative called Rest for Resistance. I just nap because I can, because I don't have to run around right now, especially in a pandemic. So I'm like, wow, there's some people that are in me literally in my body that probably didn't know what rest looked like, or didn't know what pleasure looked like either, because here's another one on the syllabus. I'm really cheesy. I'm a bit of a dork. This is another book y'all should read. It's called Pleasure Activism by Adrienne Maree Brown. I don't know where my copy of Emergent Strategy is, but that's another book y'all should read. Because there's other ways that we can explore the question of what kind of ancestor we want to be by doing that work in the present. So if we want to center joy, we want to center pleasure, if we want to make sure that we live lives that our ancestors unfortunately didn't due to some circumstance, whether it was that they were the one causing harm or they were the ones that were harmed themselves, I think a part of healing their trauma is if we do our healing for ourselves. I really think that that's important. So Sarah, that was the last question. Thank you. The note about compassion. Yeah, compassion is my answer for everything lately. If anybody has any other questions, I'm gonna put the slides back up for a second so that way everybody can see how to stay in touch with me, because I sense Christian's like Apollo hook happening right now of like, we're gonna have to go. But 1 second, please. And I will put that back up.
Well,
Because again, like I said, like we could talk about this for forever, but also like as one of my roommates is cooking, like y'all need to go eat too if you haven't eaten already. So again, the syllabus is embedded in the slideshow. If you click this, it'll bring you to something that looks like this, which is the Google Doc that I mentioned that has like all the books that I did a show and tell presentation about. And it tells you when the last time I updated it, and you'll see all the books, articles, essays, things that I've written, things that I've read and was like, yes, right? Like anything that has helped me form ancestors in training as a concept is here. What else are y'all about to get? You're gonna get more resources embedded in the slide as well, including something I love called the Native Land Map tool. It's a Canadian website. You type in your address and it tells you whose land you're on, literally. So that's how I know I was born and raised on Lenape land my whole life, right? And also you click to see who's around and who's still doing work. There's some more resources in here, but this is how to stay in touch with me. Because people are about to dip. Where is the present? Yeah, that's the picture that was in the Eventbrite. Mm-hmm. That's my face. That's the Ancestors in Training Instagram handle, which is exactly that. No underscore, no nothing. And the website is ancestorsInTraining.org. My Instagram that's public is Vera's Got the Juice on Instagram. And then my website is my name, veronicaagard.com. If you want to book me, you want to talk to me about something like that, that stuff, the ways to get in touch with me are public there. So don't be a stranger. Again, thank you to everybody for allowing me to present this crash course, literally, on this topic, because I know that it's a lot. It's something to chew on. But yeah.
Well, thank you, Veronica. I thought that was beyond important. I think this is a conversation, like you said, I think these conversations are being had on social media and amongst family and friends. So what I really appreciate about what you're doing is you're sort of, for lack of a better word, formalizing it and teaching us how to be more informed in how we have these conversations. Right. And also preparing us, right? Because like you said, like we often think about these, you know, how amazing would it have been to speak with our ancestors, right? I think this trains us to be those, for those to come and be honest. So as Veronica said, you can follow her on Instagram and all the other handles. We'll be sharing all that information. If you registered through the Eventbrite, you'll be getting an email with the syllabus and everything here. If not, please don't be a stranger. You can definitely reach out and we'll be more than happy to send that to you. On behalf of the Museo del Barrio, my name is Christian Martir. Once again, thank you, Veronica, for an amazing presentation. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. And make sure you stay up to date with what's going on at Museo, you can log on to the museo.org, as well as follow us on our social media handles at Museo. Take care, everybody.